guess like first question, what is your role with TLG?
Mainly, I do a lot of do a lot of art for them, but I do a lot of other things too. I do logo design, I do the book layouts, I've done just little odds and ends I just in anything that involves graphic design. I've
Sure.
designed maps, I've designed castles, I've designed dungeons, I've designed all sorts of things. Just whatever. Steve will sometimes ask me and say, "Well, we need a dungeon of something, just make something up."
That's awesome. So like they're not. It needs to have like this many rooms, and this room needs to have
it
treasure in it.
It depends. I mean, depending on the size of whatever it is they want. If they want a quick encounter, it's just a quick thing. If they want a bigger thing, I can get a little carried away with some of my designs. I mean, coming up with a 50-foot dungeon is nothing for me, but they want simple, just quick encounter stuff. Send people on a guild quest kind of encounters.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, I'm drawing like a bevy of weapons right now. Just finished a whole bunch of spears and pikes and everything. I'm into bows now.
yeah. That's for arms and armory, right?
Yeah, I just I've been belting out about 10 of these a day. It's just
Jeez.
I can you can only do so many before you want to go back and work on something else.
Oops, I just noticed that my microphone was wrong on OBS, so the sound quality will be better on my end.
Yeah,
It would be fine for you, but for the thing that I'm using to record, it was all off. Sorry.
that's it. Yeah,
But
I know a few friends of mine are musicians, so they use a lot of the equipment, but
yeah,
I can't make heads or tails of it much of the time. I have a hobbyist level of knowledge of computers.
sure. Well, enough at least to like do layouts and graphic design and stuff. I
Yeah,
think
I
that's
mean,
really cool.
graphic stuff is one thing, but I'm still trying to learn 3D stuff because that seems to be where it's at these days.
3D,
ZBrush makes
like 3D animation or
3D models for doing figures, and
oh,
if you're doing a piece of concept art for like a video game, they want a three-dimensional figure they can turn,
yeah,
or
yeah,
some guy with After Effects is going to make it move.
yeah.
I did a little bit of storyboard artwork for something related to League of Legends, and they
Ooh.
wanted me to do layered concept art. So they want a figure, but this kid I was working with in Germany, he would go and he would animate bits.
Yeah,
So
yeah. That's super cool. How long have you been doing art?
I've been doing artwork professionally since I was about 15, probably somewhere in like the mid 80s or thereabouts.
That's awesome.
Just uh, I got there was a couple of movies that Xanadu came out. I went to go see that, and they talked about this guy being impressed by Muse, and in that he had a job that he was working in a sign studio where
Mhm.
they would take a photograph of something and he would hand paint this thing to make it really large to put on a signboard outside. And I wanted that job. I was about like 11 or so when that 11 or 12 when that movie came out. I'm like, I want to do that.
That was
And
the moment.
well, I wanted to do art. I wanted, and that like looked like a cool job at the time. But
Yeah.
I was always hanging around in California. We were always hanging around the San Diego Comic Convention, Renaissance Fair, Civil War reenactment groups, and pretty much every kind of weird you can think of when I was growing up. And then, my parents decided that I needed to go hang out with people my own age instead of a bunch of Civil War reenactors. So they got me into the Dungeons and Dragons stuff with the kids down the street. It was one of the hobby stores we used to hang out with around the corner from our costume shop. There's an old place called the Command Post, and some of the old TSR guys could tell you about it.
Yeah.
They had the miniatures, war game stuff, Dungeons, Dragons, everything you can think of was in this place, from model airplanes and just anything you can think of. So they bought me all of the stuff that was out at the time in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
And I started seeing Elmore's artwork on the cover, and I thought, okay, that's more my thing. And I'd had a long conversation with a guy named Stan Lee at the San Diego Comic Convention. He was talking about art and comic books, and
I think I've
this
heard
was
the
the time.
name.
Well, he was sitting at a table, and this was before the comic convention got invaded by A-list actors, and it was a much smaller thing, so you could sit and talk to people. And he
Yeah.
had no one around him at the time, so we just had this sort of conversation about just art in general,
Wow.
comics, fantasy art, and he kind of pointed out that comics is a lot of repetition, and so I don't do repetition of characters very well. I always want to change things. So illustration is more of a, you do a fixed picture, you do a story in a picture instead of sequential art like a number of my friends do.
Sure.
But that's when I started to focus in on what it is that I was aiming at. It never really occurred to me to try to send any artwork to TSR back in the day, but it was just I used to run around doing just a lot of odd things, political cartoons for people, badges for a thing for the San Diego Sheriff's Department, just all kinds of just crazy stuff.
Wow.
I just started drawing my own things and started digging around in shows.
Right.
I really started getting into science fiction and fantasy conventions. We moved away from California and I started hitting shows in between Missouri and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Texas and just this big area all through the 90s.
Mm.
Just became fairly well known among that crowd. I met Davis at one of those things up in Tulsa.
That's cool. How old were you by then?
See, it was a mid-ish to late, or we moved out of California when I was probably in, what year is it? It's 93, so I was probably about 21, 22 around there.
Wow.
And I met Davis around 2000 or so ish at a convention. Some friends of mine who were running one of the ones in Tulsa introduced me to him because he was running around the art show looking for me. So
That's cool. It sounds
he was.
like you worked with like a lot of people growing up, just a lot of like
I,
putting yourself out there.
it was. It wasn't so much working with different. I mean, my parents had a lot of connections when we were doing. I was making costumes for living history groups. So they were making things. We had this old costume shop, and they were making stuff for when Star Wars came out. They had all that kind of thing coming out.
Yeah.
They had all the craze, all kinds of varieties of different things, and you meet people through different things, and your parents talk you up, and can I do this design and that design, and I ran into a lot of guys who were in my neighborhood at the time that were comic book artists that would hang out at the local comic shop. They're pretty big lights and Marvel and Image and all these guys these days. And one of them was a guy named Mark Silvestri. He does the Darkness comic. Used to hang out with him all the time at the local comic book shop before they all got big and famous.
Wow. Man, so that's really cool. So your parents did costumes for historical like reenactors and like
Reenactment
Renaissance
groups,
fairs.
several different movies. They did stuff for Glory, North and South, and Dream West, and several of the Alamo films, and just a bunch of different stuff. They even did providers and stuff for the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes movie way back in the day.
Wow.
And just just various weird things. We had all kinds of people coming in from the Rocky Horror Picture Show crowd. Just anything you can think of. I just exposed
Yeah.
a lot of weird.
That sounds
So,
awesome though.
yeah, it was just we did a lot of stuff traveling around in the different parts of the country. And I mean, I've done historical art for people, so
For sure.
I have a fairly extensive knowledge of costuming from just absorbing it from my environment growing up in the costume shop.
That was going to be my next question. Like, do you feel like maybe this is dumb, maybe this is a dumb question, but do you feel like you're good at like drawing clothes from just
I
being around
I
it so
can
much?
I can be fairly obsessive about drawing textures in clothing.
Wow,
So,
wow.
well, when I'm drawing a design, if I'm looking at something like there's a trend in China right now where they're revitalizing Han era styles and Han fu clothing, and they have a lot of fluid clothing movement, like you see in some of those fantasy Chinese films, like Crouching Tiger and Hidden Dragon, where the cloth is all moving around.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that fashion, and and I'll look at somebody's like cotton shirt, and they got all the little folds in the fabric, and I can get really obsessed with that kind of stuff. So some of my friends are costumers who sometimes model for me, and they have the outfits.
Sure.
I'll draw that. It's not really for anything. It's just I get really into pencil, and I get really into that. It's kind of my little zen state
Yeah.
when I drawing. So it's the thing, I considered fashion design at once upon a time, but
Sure.
it's just a little kind of like going into fine arts, a little bit too kind of pretentious for me. So,
That's fair. It seems very, very like technical and almost mechanical a little bit at a certain point. Like
well,
doing
I
the
mean,
sewing and the structuring and the
well, I have friends who are really, really good at sewing. My mom grew up with it, but funny enough, she never really wanted to go into costume. She wanted to build like model dioramas for the kind of stuff they use in movie sets. But
wow.
when she was a kid, you're not really, women weren't really allowed or weren't really encouraged to do that sort of
Yeah.
thing. My parents grew up during Britain during the war, so that was a different
Sure. Did you say they grew
thing.
up in Britain?
They grew up. My dad's from Sheffield and Nottingham area, so my mom's from London. So it's just
Cool.
during World War II, they were kids.
Yeah,
They were single digit age kids during when that when World War II was going on. So
man. And so it sounds like you all as a family have traveled around a lot.
they had this thing where it's called 10-pound palms, where they basically pay $10 to go to Australia as a part of an immigration scheme. So they went there in the '60s, and that's where I was born.
Wow.
They, so they traveled there, and they had a fairly just doing very well enough in Australia kind of life. And my aunt Madre was living in California at the time and invited them to come over and help with the costume shop. And
And this
that
was
went
after they
there.
were married and after you
Yeah,
were
yeah,
born.
they got married in the '60s or so,
Okay.
really. But after they got married, they moved to Australia
Man.
because it's just growing up in England at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of jobs in small town Sheffield, essentially, except working in a coal mine. But my dad didn't want to do that anymore after the roof collapsed on him for the second time. So they went
Don't
to
blame
go
him.
do something else. Yeah. But my dad had a military career because everybody was uh, part of the British Volunteer Army in those days.
Mm.
National service, they called it. So we did a bit of that. And my mom had been working for, she'd been doing a little work for something called what they called the Queen's Tailor, which was the business that basically supplies the royal family with clothing, essentially.
Wow.
All of the stuff, the guys you see in I think all of the guys you see in the London Tower and all the that kind of thing. So,
That's cool. And your aunt invited your mom sort of into that industry.
yeah, she'd already been living in California at the time, and she'd been working in the much smaller costume shop that they'd started with, and about that time they were doing costume contest stuff for the big San Diego Comic Convention that was a lot smaller in those days.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not like 250,000 people. It used to be about 25 to 35,000 or so. When it was back in
25
the
to
70s.
35,000 was small.
It was a pretty big
Jeez.
deal then, but it's also California, and California everything is huge.
That's fair. My one of two gaming con experiences is Gary Con, and I think it was like 5,000 people last year,
When we
this year.
started the Geneva Con convention, we probably had about 400 or 500 people show up. First couple
Man,
of years we were doing those things. It's
wow.
apparently it sounds like it's gotten a lot bigger than it was.
Circling back, so your parents paid $10 to move to Australia.
Yeah, well, then they had the cruise provided for them.
Wow,
They had a person who was a sponsor for them when they got there. And he would help them out a little bit. And they ended up landing jobs. It was one of those kind of just integration scheme things that went on at the time
sure.
because they were looking for people to move out there.
If you could pay $10 to go anywhere, to move anywhere.
Honestly, I would go to Japan.
Yeah, we've
Well,
talked about it a
the
little
kind of
bit. Or
the
sorry, you go
kind of
first.
society that it is, and the quite frankly the I guess what you call is the place that's relatively safe
Yeah,
to be.
yeah.
You know, a friend of mine lived there for a while, and she talked about the fact that you could walk around at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning as a single woman and no one would bother you.
That's the
I like
thing. Yeah,
I like quiet. I like you know,
seriously.
and I like good scenery, and when I haven't seen, there's a lot. So,
Yeah. I saw a thing recently that said, oh, I'm blanking on the name of the town, but there was a town that banned tourists. because of tourist
There
behavior.
are a lot of them out this side
Yeah,
of the world that are doing that right now too,
it's
because
fair.
people go and they want to come and cause trouble. But
Yeah,
there's a lot I can go on all day about a lot of the stuff that's going on this side of the world. But needless to say, a lot of people are upsetting each other, and a lot of the countries are saying we don't want your tourists anymore. So
right,
that
right.
goes here, that goes Europe, that's pretty much everybody right now. But
Yeah, it just
most of the
seems.
time,
Yeah,
if you're going to go somewhere, you're going to visit someone's house, and you need to learn some manners and learn at least to adapt to the locals.
right.
And a lot of people I meet here think I'm Canadian because I don't really act like somebody who's lived in the States for a while. Who am I to disabuse them of that notion? It helps me get along a lot better with a lot of different people.
Sure. Yeah.
Some of the games I play online, I'm talking to a lot of people in various guild groups that are from all over Europe. So
Mm.
I've got a big menagerie of people to talk to. And, as long as you're willing to be just get along, nobody cares where you're from. So.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of games do you play? I was a big World of
I'm
Warcraft kid.
yeah, that's my one outlet right now. I mean,
Alliance or
I get in
Horde?
there. I do both. I mean,
Yes.
I've I've done most everything you can do as an alliance character, so I'm doing all of the horde things too. But
That's awesome.
I kind of go off and go to do things myself. Sometimes you can get a really good action scene,
Mhm.
so you freeze it and you use that as an inspiration for an
I was just gonna ask if, because so World of Warcraft is so visually beautiful, I think. I was gonna say, like, do you get inspiration like from video
I hang
games, from
out where
TV
all the pandas
shows?
are.
What was that?
I go hang out where all the pandas are. I go hang out with all the pandas.
Pandora?
It's very relaxing.
Yeah.
And so, but a lot of the time, it's just if you get a good angle and you get a good visual, it's an idea in my head. And when I was learning or teaching myself how to draw when I was a lot younger, I was learning how to draw from Stan Lee's book and how to draw comics the Marvel way. So I did a lot of dynamic action. I
Mm.
like to joke my anatomy is always wrong because I'm drawing everything in superior proportions. So I don't draw the normal people proportions. So I'm
They're
drawing
just
these
better
dynamic
people.
action. Yeah, but there are ways to draw people that are anatomically accurate, but then I draw
Yeah,
superheroes. So
man.
I learned how to draw things for dynamic action, but I combined it with learning stuff from the anatomy of Boris Vallejo and Julie Bell and all of these characters from back in the day where they were doing dynamic figures, but their anatomy is a little bit more accurate than mine.
Do
I mean,
you like, sorry, go
most
first.
people would tell if you're not a professional artist, most people won't be able to tell. But like I said, I draw superheroes. That's just the way I taught myself.
Right, right. If the majority of what you were seeing was like comics and like stuff like that, I I would think that, because so I come from a writing background and I know that a lot of people who read a certain type of literature, like that shows up in their writing. Do you feel like reading
Well,
comic books and being exposed to that particular type of art kind of set the stage for how your art was going to be?
oddly enough, oddly enough, when I was growing up, I read a few comic books. It wasn't my thing, but
Yeah.
I got into like uh, Lord of the Rings and Thieves in a book series called Thieves World that came out in the 70s. Which was probably something a kid probably really not to be reading, but my parents didn't care as long as I was reading something. They didn't care.
Yeah.
But Thieves World was basically a city with every kind of corruption you could possibly imagine in the city, and I was reading it when it first came out. So I was probably about nine, or probably about 8 or 9 when I started reading that stuff.
Wow.
But yeah, and so you're reading about all these corrupt people in cities and whatnot. But then I started digging into Heinlein, and I was reading all science fiction, fantasy stuff. So uh, I mean, I go all the way back to watching anime in the '70s when Star Blazers came out. Then Star Wars was out, Star Trek was out, so I'm kind of into all of it.
That was
I
such a
I
great
get it.
time for stories.
I mean, you have the cheesy stuff like Hawk the Slayer, which is B movie gold. I mean, if you want to just something, the only time I've ever seen a movie using silly string as a magical effect, and it's just they had ridiculous in those days, and everybody had a good time. Everybody's all serious these days with their stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes you go in there, you just want to go and enjoy things. Me, I
Right.
get into art because that's what makes me happy,
Mm.
creating things. And it's just I don't much care about what it is I draw, although I have my limits. But
Right.
I like to do if on my own I'm doing things that are very I don't know Maxfield Parrish kind of ethereal, pretty kind of things. If I do that, I dug into all kinds of mythology around the world. Had a few college classes in California that went didn't do Western mythology. They did all of the Pacific Rim stuff. And
Mm.
we did China and North and South America. We did Africa. We did all of that, and completely different perspective. And there's so many stories out there. Netflix
Yeah.
apparently has discovered them all of a sudden because there's all kinds of stories about African mythology all over
Yeah.
Netflix now.
African
And
mythology seems so cool. That's one that I haven't dove into as much as I want to at all.
they actually snuck a little bit over little fun little history lessons. They snuck a lot of it over into the United States in order to keep their culture during when they were importing people into to work the fields and whatnot. A lot of the stories that were part of their myth were being adapted by the people living on the plantations who were talking about Briar Rabbit and Briar Fox and all that. They're all talking about the rabbit and fox and spider and all these characters from African myths. So they were
Wow.
using these little folk tales to keep their stories alive.
Wow.
So well, there's one guy who ran around and recorded all these little stories, and that's where you get those little childhood tales of Briar Rabbit, and Briar Fox. But they're all based on African myths that the folks who were trying to preserve their culture
Yeah.
came over and they were telling stories to each other.
That is so
So,
cool how like oral storytelling just it preserves. It keeps things alive.
and there's a lot of it that's crossing over. You've got you get shamans and you get shaman characters in one culture, and they're in Japan, and they're in Africa, they're in China, they're everywhere. So you get and there's a lot of crossover from these different kind of characters. And you get, as I was talking about some of our little chat conversations in the group, there's animal beings with mystical powers in every kind of culture you can think of.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I've been studying that kind of stuff for a long, long time because there's some really good visuals in it. It's
Right.
not I particularly believe any of it. It's just some really good stories that people have been making up, you know, all across history. People have time to tell stories when they brought the winter crops in, and they got around to sit around in the winter time, and they sit in their Viking huts or whatever it is, and they talk about and they tell their stories. And people come up
Yeah.
with some really tall tales sometimes.
Did your family tell stories to each other?
Well, I mean, we're from England, so it was always part of the culture. You have all of the British folklore. My my parents grew up with fairy stories, and they told me a few, and that we used to get all of the books, the Enchanted World books, and all these other different things, just to talk, you know, all the fables and everything else.
Yeah. Do you
My
have any
mom used
favorite like myths?
to, we'll be here all day if I get into it. There's a lot of I actually like a lot of the stories of what they call trickster myths. All
Mm.
of the type of beings that the raven from Native American cultures and even the Viking cultures. There's a lot of kind of weird crossovers with uh, beings. Even Loki was a trickster being. When you talk
Yeah.
about all of the different fox characters and the kitsune from Japan and all they were all trickster beings. They weren't necessarily bad people. They were existed like a lot of the fairy stories did in Europe to sort of help people with some life lessons.
Yeah.
you know, so the beings they were dealing with weren't always, like I said, they weren't necessarily bad. They were sometimes just necessary. People who will push in the right direction.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do you know why you feel like drawn to those types of myths?
Mostly my nature is I can sometimes be a little bit more perceptive than that, and it's good for me. And
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes it's just entertaining to give people a nudge.
I agree. I cut you off. I'm so sorry. You're about to say something about your mom.
Well, no, it's just a lot of the stories that she grew up with. When she was living in a place near London called Uxbridge. She used to live and behind her was an old church, and you see the things that were always creeping around in the churches and the little shadows moving around. Because most everything in the country is haunted.
Oh yeah.
So, and you'll see the things. Hell, I grew up in a haunted house.
Pardon?
I did. I flat out grew up in the one of the house we had in California. Funny little story. They had the people who owned it before us apparently had a maid that would help them out with things, and the maid, apparently one of the new maids, apparently did not realize they didn't realize that the little ashtray they thought was an ashtray was actually grandma's urn. So the maid decided to go tip that out, and very dizzy grandma went down the toilet. So apparently we had a very confused ghost in the house that didn't know how to leave.
Oh no.
So
That's crazy.
the family that owned the place before we did used to own an old building at a place called Old Town State Park, which was down in town where we used to have one of our shops. And every time this one restaurant would open, activity would happen in our house. So,
Like the ghost liked the restaurant?
well, apparently when they stirred up the house, or when they stirred up the restaurant, the whoever was in the house felt like they needed to do something. So
That's wild.
yeah, so
So
I've seen
if
a
you were
lot of
that
very
ghost,
I've seen a lot of very weird things I can't explain.
like what?
Just little hauntings, little weird things, just stuff you can't really explain. But people are working on it. But it's just I don't need to turn it into a religion or anything. There's just things in this world you can't explain.
Oh yeah. Do you believe in ghosts?
I've seen more than my fair share, but don't know what they are exactly. But there I've seen stuff, and
Yeah.
what it is, I don't know.
That's fair. I
So
call myself like
I
a
can't.
skeptic.
I like to use the term rational skeptic because there are
Yeah.
things out there you can't explain, but you can't really doubt the evidence of your own senses either.
Right. Like when there's no denying that like a thing happened. I get people that are skeptical because you don't want to just like jump to the immediate like cause and effect thing of like, oh, it's because it's a ghost. But like sometimes there's no other
There's
like
actually
obvious cause.
there's an institution in the United States that's actually studying that kind of stuff. It's called the Noetics Institute. They
Noetics?
actually have a noetics, and they have an actual rational scientific approach to explaining metaphysical phenomena.
That's
So
wild.
they're working on it, trying to use a scientific method to explain supernatural. So,
That's cool.
which is neat. I mean, go
Yeah.
for it.
I think like devoting resources to like investigating the metaphysical, I think that's worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, they're not trying to make a whole thing out of it. They're just
Yeah.
saying, well, let's try to logically try to figure out how some of this stuff works.
It's something we wonder about, so why not investigate it?
So it's a lot of that kind of thing that when I'm creating something, I'm thinking about. So it's like I've seen all of these myths and legends, and there's a lot of different kinds of beings out there that you could, create for art.
Yeah. Do you
No,
have,
I don't. There are
sorry.
like 4,000 distinct mythologies throughout human history, and there's a lot of ideas out there. So I don't think any one person's really hit on it.
Right. Do you have like a favorite subject for art? Is it like the supernatural or the like figures? I think Mel
Well, I'm
said
kind of a
theirs was
pretty, I'm
monsters.
kind of a pretty typical guy as far as that goes. If you've seen that coloring book people keep asking about, you'll see.
I have not seen the coloring book. It was
I
Mythic
will.
something.
Yeah, my mythic beings. I'll send you a PDF of it. It's just a lot of the stuff that I draw on my own. I'm a lot like Elmore. It's just a lot of girls,
Girls are awesome.
a lot of fantasy art, a lot of
Yeah.
fantasy beings. There's Mel and I joke about the elf maid trope and the cat girl trope.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's just
That's
it's a
really
lot of
cool.
stuff. I mean, if I can, if a lot of the time, sometimes friends of mine who are, I don't know, I guess they need a little bit more self confidence, want me to draw them. So, I've done photo shoots with friends of mine, and where they want to do a little bit more, what you call pinup, or whatever, just to help boost their confidence. I'll turn that kind of thing into a drawing.
Sure. That's really
Some of
special.
them, some of them make their own costumes. So
That's rad.
there's a friend of mine who also is big into a lot of anime and manga comics, and she's making cosplay all over the place for different shows. And she just won a prize for a bunch of her stuff for the local anime con where she's at in Indianapolis.
I was gonna ask because I know that we've talked a little bit about like anime and anime soundtracks. I think anime is so cool because it has every anime that I've seen, which is not as many as I'd like, they feel grand in some
Mm-hmm.
way that I think a lot of other mediums aren't. Is there something that you love about like just the anime or manga medium
Well,
specifically?
there are a lot of it. The fact is, a lot of it comes out of Asian men. A lot of the overblown superpowers that you see in those shows, the Monkey King, it
Yeah.
comes all. He is like the archetype of anime characters, completely ridiculous, over the top powers. It all comes from that. It comes from the chi powered mythic mythic martial artists who can do impossible things. All that Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon stuff, all of that comes from all these, several thousand years old of culture. And you mean Japanese manga art can trace itself back to about the 1500s when they were
Mm,
starting doing these little comic books and little designs like that. That's where it all kind of started. So it's embedded in the culture.
mm,
There's a lot of it is flat out wish fulfillment. I mean, who doesn't want to go to another world to get cheat level powers and basically do something meaningful? That's what a lot of these things are.
yeah.
The the countries that produce them, the Chinese are getting into it, the Koreans are getting into it. There's a solo leveling just came out, Korean artist, very very popular story, but set in the modern world. But a lot of this stuff is people. A lot of these countries are overworked. Everybody's overworked, but a lot of
Yeah.
people are. But they get up there and they get on the internet. They go on to the So You Want to Be a Novelist site, and they put up their stories up there, and publishers will come and find them. So our online got started that way. All of the big stories got started on these online sites because the
Mm,
publishers wanted to come talk to them.
yeah.
So a lot of it is pure fantasy wish fulfillment. They go to another world and they get these cool superpowers. But that's not the only genre that I follow. There's a lot of
Yeah.
these ones that there's one called Bottom Tier Character Tomozaki, which is a series about a kid in high school who's just an ace video game player, and he is always competing with this other person that he didn't know yet, who's also an ace video game player, and they decide to meet up. This girl that he meets up with is like the ace of her school. She's like
Yeah.
the top grades, super popular, everything, and he is just basically a slob. And she gets very disappointed meeting with this person that she's been competing with, and he basically complains to her that, well, you've got all the advantages because of your looks and your smartness, and but the rest of us who are bottom tier characters don't get have all the advantages born with. She says, I'm going to introduce you to the best RPG that you've ever encountered, called the Game of Life, and I will show you specifically that there are a set of rules in this game that I learned and I developed that can make you like me. Because
Mm,
she and and they explained how to get along
yeah.
in real life in video game terms, specking your character,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, developing your look, putting a skin on, all of that kind of stuff. And I wish to hell I'd had that when I was in my middle school years, because I
Yeah.
could have really used it.
Oh, yeah.
Because I
God.
understand those characters, but and I also read the little romantic comedies and all of that kind of stuff because I can be hugely sentimental about some stuff too. Because there's a lot of
Right.
relatable characters in those too. So it's not just the fantasy stuff I read.
Right.
There's
Right.
a lot of these stories that are written by a country full of some very wise people because they're coming up at these stories based on all of their Shintoism philosophy and Buddhism and all these things were a culture that is taught critical thinking and reasoning from a very young age, and so you go through step by step, and they pull all of this stuff into their books,
Mm.
centuries of culture into these stories where they're talking about uh, you know interactions with each other,
Yeah.
what certain moral lessons they take to another world. Is incredibly powerful people, but they try not to engage in wholesale slaughter. With
Yeah.
these superpowers, you've got some of the books are exception. Some of the other ones are the guy who comes in there with his transmutation powers and creates modern day machine guns in them. But
That'll happen. You got your bad apples.
I mean, you get into, Sword Art Online is essentially like a Lord of the Flies story, where even the Matrix, where they've been put into, or Hunger Games even, where they've been put into a world created by a madman who says, I want to create something that talks about the fundamental nature of the human soul. And
Mm.
this guy's ability to rise above, much like Neo on the Matrix, beyond the power of the machine that runs the world.
Yeah.
and, and
I would
so
hate.
there's all these stories.
Yeah.
Some people might find them a little frivolous, but if they actually try to watch them, it's the same kind of stories as isekai stories have been going out back forever. John Carter of Mars,
Mm.
Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. It's all out there.
Oh
Every
yeah.
kind of that is some character throughout history. There's always been stories of characters walking into little pocket universes of the fairylands and all of these kind of things, where they step sideways into another world with populated by alien beings. But all of these stories are the same all over the world. There's always these little characters going into alternate realities, dimensional pockets, other worlds. The lands of the Fae, the Unseelie Court, all of this business, and they have the same kind of thing over in the middle and over in Asia, basically. The yokai. There's that guy named Mizaki who's been all kinds of awards lately. Who's been doing all of his My Neighbor Totoro and all these kind of characters. They're stepping in these little pocket dimensions. It's the same stories.
Yeah.
They're all around the world. But all of a sudden over the last 20 years, it's been like the early 70s since some of the first anime and manga came out.
Mm.
Especially started filtering over the United States, and it's huge now. The $24 billion
Yeah.
industry, insane. But it's this mass market of things. They even got a minister in Japan that oversees all of this stuff to get it out there. And there's a whole mess of role playing games.
Really? I guess I
Yeah,
shouldn't be surprised by that. I just don't know anything about it. That's awesome.
there's series like Goblin Slayer and all of them. They've Goblin Slayer's been made into its own RPG, but
Yeah.
the author of the Goblin Slayer series is a huge Dungeons and Dragons fan. He even
Wow.
has Gary Gygax as a god in his world. So the whole game is basically a big Dungeons and Dragons game.
Yeah.
They talk about levels and all of this kind of stuff. A lot of these stories are characters being reborn in RPG settings, and or even what they something called an Otome game. I see this Baldur's Gate thing running around where there are these little romantic counters in there. I like to call it 50 Shades of Moonshade. But, but they have something in Japan called an Otome game, which is kind of these little things where you have to rate, it's an RPG and you have magic and spells in it, but you have to kind of solo play and raise affection levels with different types of characters, kind of like a little romantic game,
I
like
love like
Burroughs.
dating sims like that.
Well, it's kind of like it. It's not quite a dating sim, but it's a lot of the stories now are doing where the characters are going into these little Otome games to go in and change
Yeah.
the story around.
Yeah, yeah,
They don't want to die and become the tragic villainess in the stories,
for sure.
so they flip the whole thing on its head.
Do you still play like tabletop RPGs and stuff like that?
If I could find a group, I would, but
Oh man.
again, there's a friend of mine. There's actually a friend of mine who lives. My friend who lives in the States. Her cousin actually lives over here, up in just a little bit north of me. And
Yeah.
sometimes we hang out over the last several years. But her and her husband have a game group. But she's a writer herself.
Yeah.
Teaches drama classes and whatnot. I
One.
grew up. A lot of the a lot of the shows I've been, I know a bunch of writers.
Yeah.
Whole loads of writers I've met at conventions and just fun to hang out with, done covers for, and do all kinds of stuff for. So.
That's cool.
not everything I've done has been for troll or games. Like you met one of the guys I did some artwork for when I sent him over at GaryCon. A guy named Dennis did the Adventure Maximum game system.
Yeah, was that
He
this
was right
past
out,
GaryCon here?
yeah, he was right outside the door from you guys. But I've known him
Sweet.
since like I don't know since the early '90s or so when I used to
That's
hang out on
awesome.
the phone. So I met him way back when he first started developing that game.
Wow.
So I know
When,
a lot of the people in the science fiction circuit around that area. So
sure. Have you played like a science fiction tabletop RPG? So far, I've only done like the
I've
high fantasy thing.
I've played pretty much everything there is. I mean, we used to play Champions for a while when I was living in Arkansas, and we played all kinds of stuff. And I've done science fiction, I've done fantasy, I've done just pulp, sword and sorcery. I've done all of it.
Yeah.
But my own personal game is like super high fantasy. It's technomancy almost. So yeah.
Mm. How would you describe technomancy?
Magic has been incorporated into science when you're using mana to power things. It's
Mm.
like steampunk that uses steam engines to power things. Magical based societies are using what they call mana, sort of a fifth element to power their technology.
Yeah.
So you get your building, I don't know, engineering golems, just creating battle mecha out of out of mana powers. So that's all kinds of stuff. I mean, if there, I'll play anything.
Yeah.
I mean, almost anything. I like to keep it within a certain level of good taste.
Right. I guess, I mean, are there any things either like, well, I guess this is like a multiple question. Are there like subjects for art that you loathe doing and or are there like,
there are things I
yeah,
there are things I will not do.
yeah,
I personally, uh, the figure people artists have been doing artistic nudes for forever. I like to. I can do a nude figure. So what? There's nude figures all over the internet. I don't care. I
yeah,
want to do a. I want to do a story. I mean, we
yeah,
did. I did figure drawing, and sometimes I would add things to the model that we're drawing in class. I draw extra. My teachers always picked on me for it. But we gotta draw what you're seeing. I said I am drawing what I'm seeing. The models thought it was great, but
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
adding all kinds of stuff. And but I don't go into anything that's too far beyond like PG-13.
sure,
Personally, I don't care what other people do. There are
yeah,
a lot of the women artists I know are a lot more racy than I will ever get. I've done some stuff as a joke a time or two because usually when I'm doing stuff when I'm tweaking the conservative mindsets in some places I've lived,
sure,
and I did a couple of things which oddly enough some of these pictures became some of the best sellers I ever had among women because they liked the way I draw powerful females.
oh yeah,
Um, powerful women,
yeah,
basically. And even when I'm drawing something where their character is going to be a bit helpless, they're going to struggle valiantly. Some attitude in there because
sure,
I happen to like stories with heroines. And some of my favorite ones that I've been reading right now are strong heroine characters,
right,
even if they're not. Like the Saint's Magical Powers Omnipotent is a series I follow where this lady gets pulled in there, but she's basically a healer.
mm,
But she doesn't wait for events to move her. She
right,
decides that she's going to adapt to the world that she's in, and she doesn't have the modern convenience anymore, but she has to go find a way to fit.
yeah,
So she takes a hobby of hers that's herbology, and making things out of herbs, and she gets a job at the local herbology institute where they make potions and stuff like that.
yeah,
But she has certain healer-like, saint-like powers that she has to work on and figure out how they work. But beyond that, she just decides that she's not going to wait around for things to fix themselves. She's going to act.
yeah,
And those are the kind of characters I like.
right.
I like
When
people who,
everyone is people instead of
yeah,
like, and this is the object that is going to move the plot forward that's girl shaped. It's like
Yeah.
everyone is a
Well, no,
person with
this
agency.
is the story is about her.
Yeah,
There's one
for
about
sure.
the series I read that quiet the quiet kid in the class. It's called The Angel Next Door Spells Me Rotten. There's a quiet kid in the class, and he has an encounter and comes to the assistance of the very popular girl in the school who wears a very popular mask to hide some stuff that in their family. But these two are neighbors, but they don't really interact. They just he's got his own little quiet thing, and she's the popular girl hiding behind a popular mask.
Sure.
But they end up being an encounter where they sort of feel obligated to each other, and they start getting closer organically. Getting to know each other, letting each other in on that the fact that they're not what they appear on the surface, kind of thing. So
Right,
it
right.
builds. Those are the kind of stories I like. I don't care for the some of them are male power fantasies, fair enough, and sometimes they're completely hilarious, but it's not
Hmm.
that's not the kind of story I want.
Yeah.
I look for certain kinds of things.
What do you like about them? About those stories?
Some of them are relatable because I
Yeah.
was that quiet kid in the class.
Oh, yeah.
I
My book is
understand that
called
guy.
Quiet Kid. You're in good company.
I know that guy. I know the guy. There's one called Horimiya, another story about the kid that he's the quiet guy, glasses, hair hanging over his face, but the popular girl ends up encountering him outside of the class when he doesn't look like the quiet little
Yeah.
wallflower in the school uniform. Piercings, tattoos, weird.
Yeah, yeah.
I was a lot of very socially invisible when I was in school,
Mm.
except for people who suddenly decided to make me a target every now and again. But
Yeah.
sometimes the quiet guy is somebody other people could talk to because there was no obligation or agenda going on here. So sometimes very popular people would come and talk to me and
Yeah.
tell me things. So because I'm a very good, I keep secrets.
Yeah.
I got a lot of them I had that aren't mine, but I have no secrets personally, but I have a lot of other people's.
Right.
So that would get me into trouble sometimes. The bullying actually stopped after about 10th grade because not it wasn't hardcore, but it was there.
Yeah.
But it started after 10th grade, and my dad and I just my history teacher found out about my living history hobbies, which like only about 4 people in my entire school knew about,
Yeah.
and so we came to do a history lecture in front of my class. So here's my dad and going through my various history classes doing saber demonstrations in front of the class, and we all both ended up cutting each other's hands open at one point because we're just showing off. And accidents happen. They
Yeah.
happen all even when you're good at it. But after that, people stopped bothering me because they understood that I was very fast with a 4-foot edge weapon,
Yeah.
and I can take a lot of pain.
If they see you bleed and not flinch, that's someone not to mess with, I
Many
guess.
years of reenacting, uh, we do a lot of very silly things. We're
Yeah.
dealing with black powder weapons, we're dealing with swords, we're dealing with sharp objects. But Hollywood discovered reenactors, and they discovered that we work cheap. So a lot of those movies that you see with a lot of people in the background are
Yeah.
us.
That's awesome.
The Glory, like in the movie Glory, but then back came out in '89. They did a lot of filming in Gettysburg at the reenactment in '88. So the first few minutes of that film, all those lines of soldiers that are in it, is all Gettysburg footage. And
Wow.
my mom made Matthew Broderick's uniform for that.
Wow.
Because a friend of ours was the co-producer of that film.
Mm.
He was part of our reenactment group in California. So
That is so
just
cool.
we did a lot of stuff in those days that they usually pay stuntmen for. We don't, and we were insane enough to do it. Even Patrick Swayze thought we were insane, crazy when we were doing it. When he was getting in the middle of some of the stuff, and he wanted to go fight with the reenactors, but Hollywood was scared to death of letting him go do that because
Yeah.
we were dangerous.
They
So
cut each other's hands
a
open.
lot of
Didn't you see?
those things that I grew up doing, learning how to use all varieties of medieval weapons, Civil War weapons, even all the way up to World War II weapons, all reenactor stuff, and things they would hire us for in movies, just to go places in different parts of the country.
Hmm.
And like one of the Alamo films, there's a whole bunch of Mexican uniforms in those days. We made a bunch. We made about 400 of those while sitting around in San Diego Wild Animal Park when they were doing
Wow.
living history with sewing buttons on. My mom enlisted people to go. Here's sew buttons.
That is so,
So
and while all this was going on, were you still kind of in that like high school kind of age, or did this go on for
most
like
of
many
those early
years?
days of reenacting, I started doing this probably when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My dad got
Okay.
into it big time because of all of the reenactor guys who used to hang out, and I would go
Yeah.
being raised by what they call cadet corps crowd, where they would teach the more responsible kids how to use various weapons because we knew they were safe. Had
Yeah.
to go through all kinds of safety checks. Had to go through all kinds of training to be able to operate even a blank weapon
Yeah.
can be dangerous in the hands of an idiot. So, and think accidents happen, but over the years you pick up stuff. You pick
Yeah.
up, you know, you can pick up medieval skills from Renaissance fairs. You pick up martial arts, and you pick up all kinds of different things over the years. And
Yeah.
so, a lot of the stuff I draw, I know how the sword fighting works because I've done it.
Yeah.
I know how jousting works because I've done it. I've done sword fighting on horseback with a guy versus a spear.
Jeez.
And full running. I've done all kinds of crazy stuff over the years, so I know how it works. But
It
a
sounds like
lot
you
of the
really care
people,
about it.
a lot of the people I used to go to school with had no idea that we were doing a lot of this kind of. I had a few
Yeah.
friends I used to sit with at lunch, but they knew. But by and large, my entire school body had no clue I was doing any of this kind of stuff but
Mm.
you really couldn't talk about it with them because everybody was trying to do the cool thing,
Yeah.
and I was doing all of this stuff outside of school.
Which
But
more
how
often
can
than not, the cool
you
thing was like not caring
there's
about stuff.
there was no way to relate
Yeah.
to anybody you went to school with. And I found the underground gamers at the time because it was the 80s and all the
Yeah.
gamers are underground these days.
And
And
so
those,
it was literal kind of for you. So like you went to school and had like your normal like school kid life. And then
Mhm.
after school, you were going and fighting on horseback and firing weapons and like
You go
sword
up to,
fighting.
we used to go up to this place called Fort Tejon, which was a little bit north of Los Angeles. It's an old Civil War kind of military outpost that used to be in California. Well, it was there a bit before the Civil War. The Dragoons came over California and tried to settle the country while it still belonged to Mexico.
Mm.
But all that stuff going on. But they had this place up there where they would do skirmishes there. And then we'd go around to different parts of the United States. And we moved over to Arkansas
Yeah.
in the 90s. We started doing all of the stuff that was around there, Louisiana. And let me tell you, you never want to go do a reenactment in the middle of summer in Louisiana in a uniform because it was hot. It was very humid.
And you'd have to
And
be
I
in
did
like
the
the full garb and everything
Oh
too.
yes, you do. You have to do
Jeez.
the full wool uniform. But I did the smartest thing I could. I found a crowd of women to sit in the middle who were fanning themselves.
Just be near the
And
current.
yeah, that damn right
Jeez, yeah.
I did. As the man said in Big Trouble in Little China, the wise man knows how to come in and out of the rain.
Well, I think those words of wisdom are an excellent place to end.
I know,
Thank you for your time.
I'll keep you here all night if I can keep going.
Well, hey, we might do more of these. I like the more of these interviews that we kind of like publish. If people have other questions or if we want to do more, we totally will. So I might call you again.